The wind shifted just as Samuel Whitaker reached the bend in the wide, curved path that led back to his farmhouse. Snow moved across the ground in thin, whispering sheets, not falling so much as sliding, like time itself, never asking permission. His boots pressed into the frost, each step steady, practiced, disciplined, yet something inside him felt misaligned, as if his body knew where to go while his purpose lagged behind. Christmas Eve had arrived quietly that year. No music drifted from the house, no lights blinked in the windows, only the old oak tree stood near the fence line, its bare limbs stretched toward a pale winter sky, holding decades of memory in its silent posture. Sam paused there, resting a gloved hand against the fence. Solid wood, straight posts, boundaries still intact. Integrity had never been his struggle. Direction was. He had lived simply for as long as he could remember. The farm was paid for. The animals were calm in the barn, sensing no threat. His routines were clean and efficient. Discipline still ruled his mornings and evenings alike. And yet, standing there beneath the dim glow of the horizon, Sam felt an unfamiliar weight press against his chest. Not grief, not fear, but a quieter ache. It was the ache of a man who had done everything right and could no longer explain why. Inside the house, a single lantern burned on the kitchen table, casting a warm circle of light over an empty chair. Sam hadn't bothered with decorations. It didn't feel dishonest, just unnecessary. He told himself that simple living was enough, that faith did not need ceremony, that purpose would return on its own, the way seasons always had. But as the wind brushed past the oak and carried the faint scent of snow, he sensed something deeper stirring. An unspoken question rising in the silence. Not a question about work, not about survival, but about meaning. And as Samuel Whitaker stood there on Christmas Eve, with a life built on consistency and responsibility, he could not escape the truth pressing gently against his spirit. Clarity does not always come from doing more. Sometimes it comes from being still long enough to listen, but it didn't start there. We must go back a little in time. Years earlier, long before Christmas felt quiet, Samuel Whitaker's days began before dawn, with the same steady rhythm that shaped the land around him. Morning air would cling cold to the fields, and mist often hovered low over the pasture, blurring the fence lines until clarity returned slowly, as if the earth itself needed time to wake. Sam liked that hour best. It reminded him that direction didn't arrive all at once. It revealed itself step by step. Back then, purpose had felt uncomplicated. He rose with discipline, pulled on his working gloves, and stepped into the familiar order of chores. Feed bins were filled with care, not haste. The rope he used to secure the barn doors hung neatly on its peg, coiled with intention. Nothing on the farm was wasted, not time, not effort, not responsibility. Stewardship wasn't a concept Sam talked about. It was a practice he lived out quietly, every day. At the edge of the property stood the old oak tree. Even then, its trunk bore scars from storms long past, its roots gripping the soil with unwavering resolve. Sam often paused there, hand resting against its bark, feeling a strange reassurance in its endurance. The oak didn't rush to grow. It didn't fight the seasons. It simply remained, strong, patient, faithful to its place. In those days, his wife, Margaret, would leave a mug of coffee warming on the counter. No notes, no grand gestures, just consistency. Their life together had been shaped by intentional living, small choices made daily, guided by long-term vision rather than urgency. They spoke often of building something that would outlast them, even if no one ever noticed. Purpose, Sam believed, was found in doing what needed to be done, well, and with integrity. When Margaret passed, the farm didn't change. The routines didn't break. Sam's discipline held firm, like a fence line straightened after a storm. He woke at the same hour, worked the same fields, prayed quietly before meals, offering gratitude without asking for anything in return. Emotional maturity, he told himself, meant continuing forward without complaint. And yet, over time, something subtle shifted. The mist no longer lifted as easily. Days began to blur together, not from exhaustion, but from sameness. Sam still knew how to live, but the why had grown faint. His long-term vision, once anchored in shared dreams, now felt undefined. Leadership had turned inward, but without a clear direction to guide it. Christmas came and went each year with polite acknowledgement, a meal prepared, a prayer spoken, then back to work. Simplicity, once rich with meaning, began to thin into routine. He didn't notice the change at first. Purpose erosion rarely announces itself. It arrives quietly, disguised as stability. Sam told himself that discipline was enough, but discipline, without clarity, eventually becomes weight. Standing in the pasture one cold morning, watching the mist lift inch by inch, Sam felt a question surface, not sharply but persistently. It lingered as he walked the wide, curved path back toward the house, past the oak, along the fence that still stood straight and true. He had built a good life. He had lived with integrity. He had remained faithful to his responsibilities. So why did the days now feel unfinished? That question followed him into the season that would test him most, not through loss or hardship, but through the quiet uncertainty of a man who had lost sight of his purpose without losing his way. And Christmas, patient and honest, was drawing near. There had been a time when Samuel Whitaker could name his purpose without hesitation. It wasn't ambition. It wasn't growth for growth's sake. It was something slower, humbler, like tending soil year after year, trusting that what mattered most happened beneath the surface. That understanding had come to him one winter evening long ago, during a season much like this one. The house had been warm then, the windows fogged from cooking, the outside world hushed under early snow. Margaret had gone to bed already, leaving Sam alone at the kitchen table with a ledger, a lantern, and his thoughts. He remembered setting the books aside, realizing suddenly that numbers had never been the point. He bowed his head, not out of habit, but out of need. It wasn't a long prayer, no carefully chosen words, just a quiet moment of gratitude and surrender. He thanked God for the land, for the work, for the strength in his hands and the clarity that had guided his steps thus far. Then he asked, not for more, but for faithfulness. That night, insight arrived without spectacle. He understood that his role was stewardship, to care for what had been placed in his hands, to live in a way that honored God's timing rather than forcing his own, to build a life steady enough that it didn't require applause to feel complete. His dream had been simple, to keep the farm whole, to live with integrity, to pass on something solid, values, if not inheritance. That dream had carried him for years, but dreams, Sam had learned, require tending just like fields do. Neglect doesn't destroy them all at once. It starves them slowly. Now, years later, he sat alone again at that same table, the lantern casting familiar shadows. Outside, the wind nudged the barn doors, testing the rope that held them closed. Inside, Sam felt the quiet tension of a man who had stayed disciplined but drifted from vision. Purpose, he realized, wasn't lost, it was unattended. He looked out the window toward the pasture, where the horizon held a faint glow even in winter. Somewhere beyond the fields, beyond the routine, clarity waited, not in change for change's sake, but in remembering why he had chosen this life in the first place. Sam placed his hands flat on the table and closed his eyes. No words this time, just stillness. In that silence, he sensed something steady and patient, like the oak standing through storms, like the fence holding its line. God's guidance did not rush him. It never had. It simply reminded him that long-term purpose is revealed through faithfulness renewed, not ambition reinvented. Samuel Whitaker rose from the table with a quiet resolve, not a plan, not a breakthrough, but a willingness to listen again. The dream was still there, and Christmas, with all its gentle honesty, was about to show him what simple living had been trying to teach him all along. The trouble did not arrive like a storm. It came the way winter always did, slowly, quietly, with small changes easy to dismiss. Samuel Whitaker noticed it first in his hands. The work was the same, yet the weight felt heavier. The seed bags pressed into his palms with a dull insistence, and the rope he dragged across the frozen ground left deeper grooves than it once had. Not because it was heavier, but because he was no longer fully present. Frozen soil resists even the most disciplined effort. Each morning, Sam rose on time. Discipline still governed his habits. The barn doors opened and closed as they always had. Feed was measured, water checked, fences inspected. From the outside, nothing had slipped. Inside, clarity had. He began to move through his days as if following a map whose destination no longer mattered. Strategic thinking, once natural to him, dulled beneath repetition. He solved problems efficiently but without vision. Responsibility remained, but joy had quietly withdrawn. One afternoon, as a hard wind cut across the pasture, Sam noticed a section of fence leaning slightly inward. A single post had loosened where the ground had frozen and thawed too many times. It wasn't urgent, it could wait. That thought unsettled him. He had never been a man who let small breaches stand. As the wind shifted, carrying sharp cold against his face, Sam felt something familiar tug at his spirit. Not fear, but warning. Animals sensed it too. The cattle moved closer together, their calm disrupted by something unseen. Sam stood still, working gloves clenched, listening to the wind drag the rope along the ground behind him. Discipline was no longer enough without direction. That night, fatigue settled into his bones deeper than usual. He sat at the kitchen table, staring at the lantern flame, feeling the weight of questions he hadn't named yet. His long-term vision, once steady as the oak, now felt blurred, like mist refusing to lift. "What am I tending this for?" he asked aloud, the words falling into the quiet room. There was no answer, only the ticking of the clock and the hum of wind along the eaves. Days passed. Christmas drew closer. The farm remained orderly, but Sam's inner strength thinned. He caught himself lingering longer by the window, watching frost creep across the glass. He slept less soundly. His prayers shortened, not from doubt, but from weariness. Integrity still anchored him. That had not wavered. But purpose erosion had a way of draining resilience. One morning, the rope snapped. It wasn't dramatic, just a sharp sound, quick and final. The barn door swung wider than it should have, banging once before settling crooked. Sam stood there holding the frayed end, his breath clouding the air. The rope had been old, worn. He should have replaced it weeks ago. The moment struck him harder than it should have, not because of the rope, but because it mirrored something inside him. He'd been holding things together out of habit, not intention. Sam leaned against the barn wall, eyes closed, the wind pressing against his back. For the first time in years, he felt the temptation to ask an easier question, not what is right, but what is convenient. That thought frightened him. Leadership, he knew, was first exercised within. And a man who lost leadership over his own purpose risked losing more than productivity. He risked losing discernment. That evening, he repaired the door with a new rope, pulling it tight, not firm and clean. His hands remembered how. His heart struggled to follow. As darkness settled, Sam stood alone beneath the oak tree. Its branches creaked gently above him, unmoved by his unrest. The tree had weathered storms without question. It did not ask why it stood. It simply did. Samuel Whitaker, however, felt unmoored. Christmas was days away, and the quiet internal collapse, unseen, unnamed, had reached its deepest point. The letter arrived 2 weeks before Christmas, tucked among feed invoices and a seed catalogue Sam hadn't ordered. It was brief, polite, precise. A developer from the nearby county seat had acquired land bordering Sam's western pasture. There were plans, ambitious ones, a storage facility, a widened access road, progress, the letter called it. The closing line suggested a meeting to discuss options that could be mutually beneficial. Sam read the letter twice, then folded it neatly and placed it on the table. He had seen this kind of language before. Strategic, smooth, carefully shaped to sound reasonable while pressing for advantage. It wasn't illegal, it wasn't loud, but it was designed to test boundaries. 2 days later, the man arrived. His name was Mark Collins. Clean boots, confident handshake, eyes that measured more than they met. He spoke quickly, efficiently, as if time itself were a resource he managed better than others. He admired the farm openly, praised Sam's stewardship, then gestured toward the fence line near the oak. "That boundary," he said, smiling, "isn't exactly where the survey markers suggest it should be." Sam didn't argue. He walked the line in silence, hands behind his back, studying the posts set decades earlier. The fence had always stood true. He knew the land the way a man knows his own breath. Mark offered a proposal, a small adjustment, a payment generous enough to feel respectful, paperwork that could be finalized before the end of the year. "It simplifies things for both of us," Mark said. "You wouldn't even notice the difference." Sam noticed the way the wind shifted as the man spoke, brushing past the oak, carrying the scent of snow. He noticed the cattle quieting, attentive. He noticed something else too, a familiar pressure building inside him. Convenience. The money would help. Repairs needed doing. Winter costs were rising. And truthfully, Sam didn't need that stretch of land the way he once had. Purpose had already felt thin. Why fight a battle that didn't seem essential? That night, Sam sat alone at the kitchen table, the letter open again beside the lantern. He imagined how easily this could be resolved. No confrontation, no loss of reputation. A simple signature integrity, he reminded himself, often costs more than convenience ever could. But clarity wavered. 2 days later, Mark returned with an escalation. He had filed a preliminary claim citing outdated county maps. Nothing final, nothing illegal, just enough to introduce uncertainty. "These things tend to resolve themselves," Mark said, voice calm, "especially when both parties are reasonable." Sam felt the pressure tighten. He walked the wide, curved path that evening, boots crunching over frozen ground, thoughts circling the same question. Was this a hill worth standing on? Or was pride disguising itself as principle? At the oak, he stopped. The tree had stood through decades of boundary disputes, storms, seasons of neglect and care. It didn't bend to convenience. It didn't shift because someone else wanted more space. Sam realized then that the land wasn't the real issue. The test was whether he would surrender his boundaries simply because he was tired. The third escalation came quietly. Mark spread word in town, nothing overt, just suggestions, that Sam was difficult, stuck in the past, resistant to progress, the kind of man who slowed things down. Sam heard it in the feed store, in half pauses and careful looks. Leadership is rarely tested when it's applauded. It is tested when it is misunderstood. That night, Sam prayed, not for victory but for discernment. He asked to see clearly, to act with moral courage rather than defensiveness. Silence answered him, but it was a steady silence, not an empty one. The next morning, he met Mark by the fence line. "I won't move it," Sam said calmly. "The boundary stands." Mark studied him, irritation flickering beneath the polish. "You're choosing difficulty," he replied. "No," Sam said. "I'm choosing responsibility." The conversation ended without resolution. Snow began to fall, light and steady, covering tracks as quickly as they were made. Sam walked back toward the house, shoulders heavy but spine straight. He had no guarantee of outcome, only the quiet knowledge that leadership had required a decisive action, and he had not turned away. Christmas was close now, and though the cost of integrity weighed on him, something else had begun to return, faint but present, clarity. The unraveling did not come through confrontation, it came through exposure. Mark Collins' plans moved quickly, too quickly. The access road required permits that had been rushed. Environmental assessments were signed before winter conditions had been fully considered. What had been framed as strategic efficiency revealed itself, in time, as impatience disguised as confidence. Sam heard pieces of it the way truth often travels in small towns, quietly, indirectly. A delay at the county office, a survey challenged by a neighboring landowner, questions raised about easements that had been assumed rather than verified. The same cleverness that had pressed against Sam's boundaries now worked against its own foundation. One morning, as Sam repaired the leaning fence post, this time carefully, deliberately, he noticed how still the pasture felt. The cattle grazed calmly despite the cold. No wind rushed through the oak's branches. The land rested. By the end of the week, Mark did not return calls. By the end of the month, the project stalled. The truth, when it surfaced, was simple. In his effort to move fast, Mark had skipped steps that could not be skipped. He had mistaken momentum for wisdom. Strategy without character had produced speed, but no stability. Sam did not feel satisfaction when he learned this, only sobriety. He understood now that injustice often collapses under its own weight. No retaliation is required, no clever counterstrike. Character, when left standing long enough, reveals what cleverness cannot sustain. One afternoon, Sam walked the fence line again, testing each post, ensuring the rope was secure. His movements were unhurried, intentional. He paused beneath the oak and looked out across the pasture where the horizon held a pale winter light. The pressure that had pressed so heavily against him weeks earlier had eased. Not because circumstances had dramatically changed, but because he had. He had chosen integrity when convenience tempted him. He had held the boundary when fatigue whispered surrender. Leadership, he realized, had returned not through victory, but through alignment. That evening, Sam sat at the kitchen table with the lantern lit, hands wrapped around a warm mug. He did not celebrate. He did not rehearse what might have happened differently. He simply offered a quiet moment of gratitude, for clarity restored, for discernment honored, for strength that had arrived when he had chosen responsibility over ease. Outside, the first real snowfall of the season began, steady, gentle, covering the land without force. Christmas was days away, and though the farm looked the same as it always had, something within Samuel Whitaker stood more firmly than it had in years. The trial had passed. The deeper work was just beginning. The storm arrived on Christmas Eve, just after dusk. It did not come with violence, but with resolve. Snow falling heavier now, wind tightening its grip on the fields, testing roofs, fences, and resolve alike. Samuel Whitaker moved with practiced calm, lantern in hand, checking the barn one last time before night settled fully. The animals were unusually still, eyes soft, bodies relaxed, as if they trusted something he could not yet name. The wind shifted as he stepped outside, not abruptly, just enough to change its sound. Sam paused. He had learned to listen for that change over the years. A shift like that meant the storm was passing, not building. It meant direction. He looked toward the horizon, where a faint golden glow pressed against the heavy sky, thin but unmistakable, Light did not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it waited for the storm to finish speaking. Inside the house, Sam set the lantern on the table and removed his gloves. The room felt warmer than usual, though the fire burned no stronger than before. He sat, not from fatigue, but from stillness. For the first time in months, his thoughts did not race ahead or fold inward. They rested. He remembered something Margaret used to say during winters like this: "Simple things hold best when the noise quiets." He had nodded then, understanding without fully knowing why. Now he did. Purpose had never left him. It had been waiting patiently for him to stop confusing movement with meaning. Sam bowed his head, not out of habit, but recognition. Gratitude rose before words did. He thanked God for the land, for the trial that had clarified rather than crushed him, for boundaries that had held when he had been tempted to loosen them. No miracle followed, no voice, only insight, clear and steady. His purpose was not to expand, impress, or keep pace with anyone else's vision. It was to live aligned, to steward what had been entrusted to him with consistency and integrity, to remain faithful in the quiet seasons, trusting that God's timing did not depend on urgency. Outside, the storm began to soften. Snow slowed, wind loosened its hold. One of the cattle let out a low, calm sound, content, settled. Healing had arrived not through change, but through peace. Sam stood and walked to the window. The golden horizon stretched wider now, touching the edges of the fields, the oak's branches outlined in light. The fence line stood clean and straight beneath fresh snow, unbroken, honest. Clarity did not feel dramatic. It felt complete. In that moment, Samuel Whitaker understood something he had spent years circling. Simple Christmas living was never about having less. It was about seeing clearly what was enough. The storm ended as quietly as it had begun, and in the silence that followed, the truth settled deep within him, unshakable and sure. God never arrives late. Christmas morning arrived without spectacle. Snow lay smooth across the fields, untouched and clean, as if the land itself had been given a moment of rest. Samuel Whitaker stepped outside just after sunrise, the cold sharp but honest, the horizon glowing softly in gold. The oak stood as it always had, steady, unhurried, rooted in truth. The fence line held firm, a quiet testimony to boundaries honored over time. Sam breathed deeply, feeling no urgency to move. Leadership, he now understood, begins the moment a man chooses integrity when no one is watching. Purpose is not recovered through ambition, but through alignment. Those who live simply are not lacking. They are often the ones who see most clearly. The greatest treasures of Christmas had never been wrapped or counted. They were found in stillness, in gratitude, in the courage to remain faithful when clarity felt distant. Simple living had not limited Samuel Whitaker's life. It had protected it, and so the season passed not with noise, but with peace. Like the land after a storm, his heart rested, ready for whatever God's timing would unfold next. Timeless truths remain. Those who plant in faith harvest clarity. Character outlasts cleverness. Often, God strengthens a man before he blesses him, and in the quiet that followed Christmas morning, one truth stood above the rest. Simple living holds the greatest treasures. Before you move on with your day, pause for a moment. Think about how many times you've kept going out of discipline, but quietly lost sight of why you started. How many seasons you've stayed faithful, yet wondered if purpose would ever feel clear again. Samuel's story isn't about land, winter, or Christmas. It's about men and women who live responsibly, carry weight silently, and still feel a quiet ache for meaning. It's about discovering that purpose doesn't return through noise or pressure, but through alignment, integrity, and patience with God's timing. If this story spoke to something in you, It's because you're not done yet. Clarity is still forming. Strength is still being shaped. Subscribe to this channel if you're seeking stories that restore focus, build inner strength, and remind you that simple, faithful living still carries deep power. Each story here is designed to walk with you, not rush you, toward wisdom and long-term purpose. And before you go, stay right here. The next story on your screen continues this journey. Another quiet test, another moment where clarity arrives when it's least expected. Watch it. Your next insight may already be waiting.